The IS-7 is one of the most well-known tanks developed by the USSR, in part due to its massive size and weight, placing it with the likes of the Tiger II. However, few know about its lengthy and intricate development process, consisting of many years of work and prototypes, with a total of 7 different prototypes sharing the name IS-7. One of these was the Object 257, the bridging between the failed IS-6 and the renowned IS-7. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. If you like our content, please do like this video and consider subscribing and hitting that bell button. There are many more such videos coming and it would be a shame to miss them. In February of 1945, a replacement program for the Object 701, the IS-4, which had just started development 7 months earlier, was requested by the Main Directorate of Armored Forces. The SKB-2 factory, which designed the Object 701, was too busy with it and was working on its production. This left a window of opportunity for Factory Number 100 to take over and begin work on the IS-4 replacement. Factory Number 100 had just lost to SKB-2, as the Object 252 and 253, the IS-6, were deemed inferior in many ways to the Object 701. An upgrade to the Object 252, known as the Object 252U, was made in November of 1944. Using pike-shaped angled armor with help of engineers from the NII-48 Research Institute. However, the changes were not able to revive the already cancelled IS-6. Despite its failure, it served as a good basis for the upcoming heavy tank. On 7th April 1945, the requirements for a 122mm tank gun with a muzzle velocity of 1000 meters per second, 2-part ammunition and a rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute were issued. Factory Number 100 had already done work with OKB-172 on the BL-13 gun, which was used on the late alterations of the Object 252 and 252U. Earlier prototypes of the IS-6 had the D-30. This new gun was called BL-13-1 and featured improvements over the BL-13, such as a mechanical gun rammer, increasing its rate of fire to a whopping 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Even a mechanical autoloader was tested, but despite its claimed solid reliability, it was sluggish and was not worth losing a crew member. It also decreased the rate of fire to 7 to 8 rounds per minute at a higher price tag. Nonetheless, the idea was never fully dropped, as the final IS-7 prototype used a loading assistant using a conveyor belt. The shells were however larger, as the gun had a 130mm caliber. Work started on the new heavy tank in May 1945, with P.P. Isakov, who had previously worked on the Object 252U and IS-2U projects, as chief designer. The turret was taken directly from the Object 252U, and so was the pike nose design. The engine and transmission, rather interestingly, were taken from the Object 253, the IS-6 variant, which used a mechanical electrical transmission, which caught fire during trials, was expensive and unreliable. The biggest change was made to the lower hull and suspension. This project would get the designation Object 257 and was the first design to get the name IS-7. As mentioned earlier, many elements from the IS-6 program were used in Object 257. The turret and pike nose came from the Object 252U, and the engine and transmission from the Object 253. However, one of the main focuses of the Object 257 project was sturdier protection. The same principle applied on the pike nose, which was implemented on the side of the hull as well. The previously flat hull sides were now angled inwards at an extreme angle, forming a diamond-shaped silhouette from the front and rear. On the downside, this caused huge internal problems. Primarily, torsion bars could no longer be used since the hull was too narrow, meaning that the suspension had to be moved on the outside of the hull. For the suspension, 4 volute springs were mounted on each bogie, with 2 wheels per bogie, a very similar design to that of the American M4 Sherman. This made the Object 257 one of the most unique-looking Soviet heavy tanks of the post-war era, as this was the first time a Soviet tank used volute spring suspension. The turret was identical to that of the Object 252U, being heptagonal and of a low profile. Inside, the gunner was seated to the left of the gun, with the commander behind him. The loader was located to the right of the gun. A coaxial machine gun was also mounted to the right of the gun and could be fired by the gunner. It is unclear if it was a 7.62mm SGMT machine gun or a 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine gun. The loader was responsible for loading this weapon as well. As the Object 257 focused mainly on protection, crew comfort and overall ergonomics of the tank had to be sacrificed. The pike-like front end of the vehicle decreased the amount of space available for the driver. As shown in the drawing, the driver's pedal would be located high up, his feet being on the same level as his torso. This would have been uncomfortable, especially when driving for longer periods of time. The driver had an entry and exit hatch on top of him, however it was directly under the gun, meaning that entering and exiting would have been frustrating when the barrel was over the hatch. To add to his misery, he only had one periscope, relying more on the commander for seeing what is around him. The gunner and commander could sit on chairs mounted to the floor through a long arm. Even for them, the conditions were not great. The low turret profile gave them very little headroom, not to mention it restricted the main gun from depressing more than a few degrees. The commander's position lacked a cupola and only had one periscope facing forwards and one backwards. This further limited his visibility. The loader was to the right of the gun, having to push the shells in with his left arm, a rather large inconvenience considering the size and weight of a 122mm shell. In addition, the ammunition was made out of 2 parts, the shell and the cartridge. In a turret bustle at the back, 30 rounds were stored, protected by an armored case. The cartridges were stored along the sides of the hull diagonally, meaning that if one cartridge was taken out, another could possibly slide down. This, however, is only speculation. The average loader could load the gun in around 15 seconds. More warheads were stored in the hull behind the driver. All this meant that the loader could easily load in the warheads, but had to bend down to grab a cartridge. As indicated earlier, an autoloader system was designed. However, despite its reliability, it was slow. If an autoloader was used, it is unknown if the loader would have been dropped or he would have had other tasks. One of the most interesting aspects of this tank is the armor layout. The pike nose was an increasingly common feature in Soviet heavy tanks of the time. It was 150mm thick, angled at 28 degrees from the side. Yet the lower hull was completely new. Instead of flat plates like on the IS-6, the plates were angled inwards, forming the same effect as a pike nose. This would have helped immensely against incoming rounds, deflecting them into the ground. The top parts were 150mm thick and angled at 30 degrees. The bottom plates were 85mm thick, angled at 23 degrees. This thickness was not maintained all the way to the bottom of the hull. Halfway in, the armor was thinned down to only 20mm, yet kept the same angle. This was most likely done to save weight, as the chances of enemy fire hitting this area were rather low, with the large suspension being in front. The new side armor was impenetrable to the German 105mm Flak 39, and the front was even strong enough that the BL-13-1 gun could not penetrate it at point-blank range. The turret armor was thick as well. The sides, although thinner in some areas, since they were curved, were 150 mm thick, angled at 45 degrees. Of course, this came at a cost. The weight of the hull increased to 23 tons. If there is something that makes the Object 257 stand out, it is the suspension. As previously stated, the lack of room in the hull meant that the suspension had to be moved on the outside. Curiously, a bogie with 4 volute springs per wheel was used. These were very similar to the M4 Sherman medium tank, and it is entirely possible the design was derived from it. The wheels were mounted on opposite sides of the bogie and had arms on either side. These arms would then be attached to 2 volute springs that compressed when the wheel moved upwards. As the weight had been increased up to 55 tons on paper, a new engine was needed. Since 1944, factory number 77 had been working on a new engine, based on the V2, called V16F. It was coupled to a similar, if not the same, electric transmission as that used on the Object 253. However, this engine was deemed very poor. Trials took place between March and May of 1945 and it was found to be unreliable. Even supercharging the engine to 600 or 750 horsepower that the IS-6 and IS-4 had would have put a huge strain on the engine and failures occurred. Even at 520 horsepower, the engine was faulty. However, an engine this underpowered would have been disastrous if mounted on a 55-ton heavy tank, considering a 50 km/h speed was wanted. Further development was done on the V16F. However, efforts were abandoned and improved V12 engines were used on further IS-7 projects. After the discovery of the Maus and Jagdtiger and their analysis, the armor on the Object 257 was deemed insufficient. The 128mm KWK-44 guns of the Jagdtiger and Maus would have pierced the hull. Likewise, the armor on the Maus and Jagdtiger was too strong for the BL-13. All this meant that the Object 257 needed to be reworked significantly. In addition, on 11th June 1945, the requirements of a new heavy tank was set by the GABTU. The weight increased to 60 tons, and the new armament was to be a S-26 130mm gun. Lastly, torsion bar suspension was required. The Object 257 clearly was not adequate, leaving factory number 100 to start work on a new heavy tank. Nonetheless, work was not in vain, as the experience gained and armor features of the Object 257 were passed on. Many other tanks were designed until the final Object 260 was made, the IS-7 we know today. That's all for this video. Make sure to like, subscribe and hit that bell button. We'll be releasing new videos on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.